Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you. Let me get that presentation up. To talk to you about a topic that has been getting a lot of press lately, and this is the origins of moral thought, moral thinking, moral judgment. So we've seen a lot of claims, especially in the media, about infants, even in the first year of life, being good, preferring helpers to hinderers. If they were to give a cookie to one individual, it would be the individual that helped another creature go up a hill, not the individual that stopped someone from trying to go up a hill. And this research is done by Karen Wynn, Kylie Hamlin, and Paul Bloom, was discussed in Paul Bloom discusses this in his book, Just Babies. And he writes, he says in an interview with the New York Times, he says, you can see glimmers of moral thought, moral judgment, and moral feeling even in the first year of life. Some sense of good and evil seem to be bred in the bone. So that's a pretty bold claim about babies in their first year of life. We see another bold claim about non-human animals being moral, being ethical, engaged in feelings of empathy and making judgments about the right thing to do. People like Frans de Waal will tell stories about Binta Jua, a gorilla at a zoo in Chicago who observed a child who was watching the gorillas fall into the moat, fall into the enclosure. And Binta Jua went down to grab the child as onlookers were watching in horror. What is she going to do with this child? And what Binta Jua did was cradled her and carried her back to a keeper and gave the child to the keeper. So Frans de Waal suggests this is evidence that the gorilla feels empathy for the child, and empathy is foundational to morality. Now, we can ask, did these infants and did this gorilla act on moral reasons? Were they engaged in moral behavior? Or are they engaged in something a little bit less sophisticated, which we might call normative thinking? What I want to talk about today is normativity as the first step in developing any sort of moral sensibility. And by normativity, I'm talking about normativity as a mode of thought. All right, so we can contrast normative thinking or ought thought with is thought, thoughts that represent the world represents the way the world is, or desire thought, which represents how I want the world to be, or thought about the past, thought about the future, counterfactual thinking. Another form of thinking is should thought, ought thought. And this is just thinking that the world ought to be a certain way. So we study animal beliefs, we study animal memory, future thinking, episodic thought, counterfactual thinking. We do the same with infants. And what I want to suggest here is that we have some reason, really strong reason to study ought thought in human infants and other animals. And we have suggestive evidence already that there is ought thought early on in humans and in other species as well. So let me say a little bit more about this idea of ought thought. The ought thought, the very first aspect of ought thought is simply creating a way to go on, creating some sort of sense that this is how we ought to act or how I ought to act, this is how things should go. This doesn't have to be a representational rule. It might just be some sort of knowledge how. And it doesn't have to be a rule that is given to the individual. It can be a rule that the individual creates for herself. So consider an example of a child sorting blocks. This is philosopher Hannah Ginsburg's example. Think of a child sorting blocks. She's got an array of different colored blocks, and she just starts putting the green ones over here and the blue ones over here. That's the right way to do things. If an adult were to come in and put a blue block with the green blocks, the child would protest and yell. This is because she has a sense of this is how it ought to be, even though no one gave her this rule. So that's the first stage. But the second stage is when you get from this kind of pure normative thinking to something that looks more like social norms. What do we have to add to this naive sense of normativity to get to social norms? I think we have to add two things. The first thing we have to add is a sense of belonging. So belonging is a pretty primitive normative notion, and for some animals, they get this normative concept of belonging pretty easily by imprinting. So the ethologists like Conrad Lorenz said that what these geese have is something that looks like an innate mechanism such that the first creature they see when they hatch is the creature they follow around. Usually it's their mother, but if it's Lorenz, they follow Lorenz around as if he is the mother. That's great for the geese, but that doesn't work for a lot of other species, and it doesn't work for species that have a wider social group as well. So there has to be some way of solving this belonging problem when it's not just your mother you belong to, but a larger cultural group as well. So the feeling, as an infant might have, that I go with this woman from the very beginning, that this woman and I, maybe at the beginning, are one, and the sense of belonging comes as the infant starts separating herself from the woman, is going to be, I think, the beginning of this kind of normative thought for mammals. But the infant's going to learn from her most intimate caregivers how to act in this world, how to eat, how to speak, how to communicate, how to touch or not touch other people. She's starting to learn the norms of that cultural society, the larger norms of how these individuals act. They go along with the sense that I belong with these people. So belonging is one aspect. The next aspect that you have to add is this learning of these facts of cultural behavior. How do we go to the toilet? How do we talk? How do we talk using language? That's an obvious cultural behavior. But another not so obvious cultural behavior are the behaviors that become really salient when we travel to countries that are very different from our own, and we don't even know how close to stand to somebody. Right? So all of these things are things that we learn without even recognizing that we know them. We know how to stand a certain distance away from someone else because the people that we belong to do it that way. What the child learns at this point, or the individual learns at this point, is how we do things around here. It's both the belonging aspect and the how, the practices. So then the next step is the moral norms. To get from social norms to moral norms, you need to add something about universal practices, universal judgments that go beyond just the cultural group. So things like harm, we ought not harm anyone, or we ought to minimize harm. We ought to follow certain rules or laws. We have to consider our reasons for action. We have to think before we act, and hence we're responsible for our actions. These sorts of things are what get added on. And so when you look at the sorts of things that typically, the kind of cognitive capacities that are required for lots of different ethical theories as far as moral behavior goes, you get some pretty sophisticated requirements, such as metacognition, since the ability to think about your own reasons for action. And these are capacities that these infants, human infants, do not have. There's a lot of debate about when exactly humans develop metacognitive capacities. Some people think it's late childhood before they really get good at metacognitive capacities. And there's a lot of debate about whether any non-human animal has metacognitive capacities at all. So these are pretty sophisticated things we're talking about when we get into morality. So instead of starting at morality, saying we're going to investigate moral psychology in humans, human infants, and other animals, I suggest we look at naive normativity in these populations. And so we can look at naive normativity in these populations by understanding these different sorts of behaviors that can be associated with naive normativity. Protests in the face of violations. And the violations may be violations of behaviors that are idiosyncratic, that the individual creates for herself, her own games, like the block sorting game. or it could be violations of norms that are given to the individual. We can also look for evidence of social norms by looking for these aspects that I added. They said, well, we have to add to naive normativity a recognition of belonging, and then a desire to do things the way the people I belong to do things. And I think we see that in the literature on imitation, in-group preferences, and prestige preferences, and I'll explain all that soon. Next. But starting first with protests in infants. So we know that at 3 years old, children are protesting arbitrary norm violations. When an individual is in the game and rules have been created arbitrarily, children who violate this rule will get in trouble by the other children playing the game, but children outside the game won't. They can use the banana as opposed to a phone if that's the rule. But how early do we see this sort of protesting of arbitrary norms? One of the things that we get with the naive normativity, this kind of normative sense, is an ability, so we get an ability to anticipate the next move, whether the move is going to be by us in a game we've created ourselves, or whether the move is going to be by somebody else, if we've got the kind of shared rules or a shared practice in a population. And so there's a kind of predictive element that is associated with this sort of normative thought as well. So one thing we might want to look at are the spontaneous response task paradigms that we see really effectively used with infants to test infant cognition. And starting by about 5 months, we can test infants on their expectations by looking to see if they seem surprised after they've seen a new stimulus that's different from a stimulus that they've been habituated to. Now, this maybe is a bit of a reach to suggest that this is normativity as opposed to just surprise at something new. But surprise does suggest an expectation of what should be. This is the way it should be, and that isn't the way it actually is. So it might not be as much of a reach as it might initially seem. I'm super curious. I would be super curious. I love interdisciplinary panels and groups because I get to learn so much from the other people around. And I've done a lot of literature searching, trying to find evidence of protests in infants before a year. Protests of behaviors like categorization behaviors that we see children spontaneously engage in early on. There's been some research that children will start protesting, engaging in vocal protesting behavior at 6 months, but these aren't necessarily protests of a norm. These are protests when mom wipes the messy face, like these sorts of protests. So I'd love to know if any developmental psychologist has done any work on giving kids materials, letting them spontaneously sort them, and then being the evil person who comes in and does it the wrong way to get a response out of the child, to see how the child responds in that case. So it's not clear. I think we don't yet know, or I certainly don't yet know, when we first get this kind of sense of naive normativity in children. But I want to suggest that at a very early age, infants have an understanding of belonging. And this infant ability to understand, to kind of have a kind of implicit understanding of belonging is associated with the ability to distinguish between the mother's milk and the milk of another lactating female, distinguish between the mother's face and the face of non-related females, that there's kind of physical contact that is typical of infants and mothers over long periods of time with breastfeeding exchanges, kind of conversations where the baby sucks and then stops sucking and then the mother jiggles and then the baby sucks again, that this kind of interaction is going to be kind of the beginnings of a recognition of we're not the same thing. We're two different things having a kind of conversation, but we go together. So belonging is also, has been investigated in the research on within-group preferences in infants. And researchers claim that 3-month-olds prefer to look at same race faces, in that 11-month-olds prefer individuals who share their own taste in food, and that 12 months infants prefer to learn from someone who speaks their own language. So it seems like early on we've got this in-group, out-group thinking already going on, or sensibility already going on in infants. The over-imitation research in human infancy is quite a complex literature. I just want to touch on one aspect of the over-imitation literature. So this research comes from Andrew Meltzoff. He originally found that by 14 months, children would prefer to manipulate a light box the way a demonstrator manipulated the light box, even if it seems weird, turning on the light box by touching it with your head as opposed to touching it with your hand. There have been a lot of other findings about over-imitation in infants, but the one that I think is relevant for us today is that infants prefer to over-imitate when the demonstrator speaks the same language that they do. But if the demonstrator speaks a different language from them, they're not nearly as likely to over-imitate. If they're German speakers and they hear a story in Russian before the demonstration, those German speakers are going to touch the light box with their hands instead. And then the other aspect of imitation and social learning that comes from the epistemic trust literature suggests that by 3 and 4 years, what we know is that children, if they can learn behaviors from they see two different demonstrators demonstrating different behaviors, they'll tend to imitate the behavior of the demonstrator that has the higher prestige, where prestige is defined as being observed by third-party bystanders. So if you've got this is the prestige model here, this guy, because he's got 2 bystanders watching him. And so the way he cuts his steak is going to be the way the kid chooses to cut his steak, not the way the other guy that no one else is watching cuts his steak. So we've got this evidence of social learning and wanting to learn, wanting to imitate, being motivated to imitate, but not just anybody. Only being motivated motivated to imitate one of us, someone from my in-group. They're the ones I want to learn from. And this motivation to learn, this motivation to imitate your in-group members is a kind of cultural glue, right? That's how we get all of these differences in social behavior, which makes it so awkward when we go to a culture that's very different and we keep bumping into people because we don't even know how to walk through a train station. All right, so that's infants. What about other animals? Again, I'm going to go through the same list, and because this has not been systematically investigated at all, I'm going to be talking about species all over the place. So this is all very suggestive. There's no argument that any one species has normativity, but it's suggesting where we should look to see normativity, to see evidence of normativity in other species. So protest of an arbitrary norm violation. This is a 6-year-old rehab orangutan named Dede, and he was the subject in an experiment that my colleague Anne Russin was doing. She has done a lot of work on imitation in orangutans, and Dede was very good at imitating her behavior. So she was giving Dede a novel imitation task where she had coconut shells, empty coconut shells, and little nuts. And she put a shell down and a nut in it, another shell down and a nut in it, and a third shell down and a nut in it. And then she gave the materials to Dede, and Dede was very upset, as Anne put it, when he saw the way she was sorting the objects. He put all the coconut shells in one pile and all the nuts in the other pile. And Anne said she had the sense that, no, this isn't the right way of doing it. This is wrong. A kind of protest of this way he wanted to categorize things. Diana Reese, who unfortunately isn't here, has another fabulous case of a protest of a developed expectation, something that looks more like a social norm that developed in the relationship between Diana and a newly captive dolphin named Circe. Is that how you say her name, Circe? So Circe was just captured from the wild, and one of the first things you do when you capture a dolphin from the wild is you have to teach the dolphin to eat fish, dead fish. They know how to eat live fish. They don't know how to eat dead fish. So she was working to teach Circe how to eat dead fish. Circe did not like this dead fish, and so Diana started trimming the tails so they wouldn't be so pokey, I guess. And Circe was very happy with this. Diana said that one day she forgot to trim the tails and threw an untrimmed tail to Circe, and Circe caught the fish, spat it out, and then engaged in this strange behavior with an upright posture, her body out of the water, half out of the water. And Diana said this was very strange. What's she doing? And she said, oh, it looks like what she's doing is giving me a timeout. And a timeout is what Diana was giving to Circe every time Circe violated an expectation, every time Circe did something wrong. Right? This is where you withdraw, you take a step back, you just stand still, you don't engage with the animal for a few seconds, and then you resume contact. And so Diana decided, I'm going to formally test this and see what's going on. And so she trimmed some tails, didn't trim some other tails, and found that every time that she fed the untrimmed tail to Circe, she got a timeout. But this was not an accidental behavior. So this looks like a protest that first of all, the method of protest was learned from Diana, but also the social norm was developed together in the dyad, in their interaction. Going back to primates, there's a lot of evidence that there is recognition of belonging in chimpanzee communities. So in the wild, John Matani has done a lot of research on chimpanzee border patrols and wars between chimpanzee groups. And this is a photograph here of chimpanzees walking along the border of their territory. They act very different when they're doing a border patrol. They're very quiet. They're single file line. And then if they go into enemy territory, they're even quieter. Sometimes there's going to be an incursion and a fight. And what they do if there's a fight is try to get the males or castrate the males, kill or castrate the males, who are the ones who are the biggest threat. Because they want the females to make the babies. So there's a recognition of an in-group and an out-group if you've got war going on. And then down here, this is some research out of Tetsuro Matsuzawa's lab where he's doing neonatal imitation with a chimpanzee infant of just a few days old. And this is Tetsuro doing the facial gesture that's being imitated by this infant chimpanzee. Over-imitation is something that has been claimed to be a place where chimpanzees fail, that chimpanzees don't engage in that kind of weird, I'm going to do it the weird way, rather than doing it the rational way. But one of my worries about the way that research has been done is that the demonstrator's always been an out-group member, has always been a human. So given what we know about humans and their desire to imitate the in-group member, I think it's too hasty to say that chimpanzees don't over-imitate. And in fact, when you train a dominant member of a chimpanzee community, one way of operating a box that can be operated in two ways to gain a treat on the inside, the way that the dominant chimpanzee engages in this behavior, solves this problem, is the way that spreads through the whole community. Even though they discovered the alternate method of opening this durian fruit box here. You can lift the flap or you can slide it. And you see on the other side, these are the transmission chains. In one group, the demonstration was to slide. Everyone, except for a couple of radical, outliers, decided to slide. And the other way, lift was demonstrated, and that's what that community engaged in. Prestige preference. this is a bit more speculative here, but Susan Perry has done research on capuchin monkeys, where she describes capuchin monkeys engaging in a very strange behavior that she calls hand sniffing. This was introduced to the group by a dominant male capuchin monkey, and it involved sticking fingers up each other's eye sockets and sitting together. Very strange behavior. Finally, is there any kind of moral norm or social norm, at least social norm protest in non-human animals? There's some suggestions that there might be, and this is where I'm going to leave things. Among chimpanzees, infanticide is rare, but it happens. And when it happens, or when threats of infanticide occur, the females engage in a big protest. They wahoo, they yell, and it looks like they think this is not the thing you ought to be doing with this little infant. You are not treating this infant the way you ought to be treating this infant. Social norm, but it looks like this might be a place where you're getting at harm, right? So it might be there you get glimmerings of morality. At least you might get some evidence of naive normativity. And I think naive normativity is where we should start before we go on and make grand claims about morality in one-year-olds or in other